are back on the Zero Hour. I'm your host, Richard RJ Eskow. We continue our coverage of the Afghanistan situation now with Stephen Miles. Stephen has been on the program a number of times before. We always look forward to speaking with him. Stephen Miles is the executive director of Win Without War. So he's been involved in this issue for many years, and he joins us now. So first of all, Stephen, welcome back to the program.
Thanks, Richard. Normally, I'd say I'm glad to be here, but obviously, challenging times we find ourselves in.
Yeah, they're deeply challenging times, and yet one of the things I keep talking about right now, Stephen, is the fact that I have to say that, in my view, Joe Biden did the absolute right thing, did what needed to be done, did what should have been done years ago, what many of us have been arguing for, and yet there seems to be a shortage of people supporting him. And of course, putting in context, we have one person in agreement there, one creature in agreement. And of course, putting in context the terrible tragedy that's unfolding now, and we all want to do as much as we can about it. It seems to me that a humane gesture, an act of sanity, however imperfectly executed, and yes, there's tragedy unfolding now. We want to mitigate it to every extent we can, but it seems to me that what gets overlooked in the coverage and the commentary is the tragedy that's been unfolding every day for 20 years that we're now in the process, hopefully, of bringing to an end. So why don't we start there? Why don't we start with there are a lot of voices like yourself here in Washington that speak rationally about this issue. I don't want to get you in trouble or anything, but why do you suppose those voices aren't being heard more often right now?
Well, it's an important conversation, and thanks for bearing with my dog. Obviously, we're still in COVID time, so we all know how that goes. I think you're right to say both that President Biden was right to do what needed to have been done a long time ago in terms of ending U.S. participation in this war, and there is a tragedy involved in that. The reality of fighting 2 decades of a war in which we've had an occupation, but let's not forget that the United States was involved for 20 years before that, militarily in Afghanistan, going back to the Soviet invasion and the days of the Mujahideen. So we've been involved for 4 decades of this conflict. That has been a tragedy for the entire time. We often haven't talked about it in the United States, but the deadliest years of this war for Afghan civilians were the last several years. This is not simply a story about something that happened a couple of weeks ago, but decades of conflict, decades where the United States has tried to bomb its way to a peaceful resolution in Afghanistan, and it hasn't worked. It has been a failure. And what we're seeing now is not only have we seen that failure going on, but the entire version of the enterprise, the entire notion that what we were doing was creating a sustainable state that would somehow last after the United States eventually left, was also a failure. That's been warned about for a long time. The corruption that the United States fueled has been warned about and written about for a long time. The challenges of the Afghan security forces has been warned about. We saw very similar situations play out with the Iraq security forces after that the U.S. built quite similarly in Iraq. And so we have seen failure after failure. And the tragedy of all this is that for American failures, the one who pays the price are the Afghan people. And so our hearts do break for the scenes we're seeing. We absolutely are calling on the president to do everything he can to save every life he can, to not just evacuate those who work directly with the United States as military translators and others, but any Afghan that needs refuge. Look, after 4 decades of conflict, after 2 decades of occupation, the United States has a moral obligation to the people of Afghanistan. That obligation is not to continue using their country as a battlefield, but it is an obligation to do what we did in places like Vietnam, which is after we have ended our war, that we open our doors to those who need safe refuge, to those who need safety. It's important that we do that. It's important that the president do that in the days ahead. But again, it is a story about a much larger tragedy than simply the one we're seeing right now.
And Stephen Miles, it's a tragedy within, a broader set of tragedies, which is our continued reckless military policy, in my view, uh, throughout the Middle East and in many cases throughout the world. My understanding is that an organization like yours, Win Without War, exists to create the field for more productive forms of engagement and behavior than runaway military intervention. Without minimizing in any sense the tragedy that we're seeing now and that we've seen for the past 20 years, one would hope that there would be a lesson to be learned by the leaders of this country, by the media of this country, by the voters of this country, that this was a mistaken policy from the beginning, that there were voices explaining why it was a mistaken policy, that it's good that we ended it, that we should seek to this kind of resolution to other engagements we may be still involved in, and to make sure we don't make this mistake, most importantly, to make sure we don't make this mistake again. And yet, when it comes to the lessons learned phase of it, obviously it's very early in the process, but it seems to me that up to now there hasn't been a rational discussion of what went wrong, why it went wrong, and what we could have done instead. And my fear, and then I'll ask for your thoughts, but my fear is that if we don't begin that process as a nation, we'll make the same mistakes all over again. But what are your thoughts?
I think on this point, perhaps, Richard, I'm slightly more optimistic than you. I will say I have seen over the last week a number of commentators, a number of folks reflecting on this in kind of the opinion pages of the country, the newscasts that we're seeing, where we've had a more robust debate about what went wrong than, for instance, I think we saw after the end of the Iraq War. I think the nature of what we've seen unfold, which is the complete failure of the enterprise that ostensibly we were there to do, the collapse of the Afghan government, the collapse of the Afghan security forces, I think that has forced a reckoning in some ways in the kind of elite media and in some of the discourse that we have to have a conversation about whether the enterprise, whether the entire idea, whether this notion of these kinds of wars makes sense. Now, that's not to say that narrative and that will win, or that there's plenty of people around this town where I am in Washington, D.C., who still think the problem was just that we didn't keep a couple thousand U.S. troops there for another 20 years. There will be those voices. What I'm saying and what's giving me some hope is we are hearing a lot of other voices. And importantly, I think most importantly, we're hearing the American public's sentiment come through on this. I think it's important to recognize that the American public turned against this war a long time ago. I think there's really two events that really pivoted public opinion in a significant way on the war. That was first the 2008 financial crisis, when a lot of Americans suddenly really were focused on what are we doing abroad in these wars? We have deep, deep challenges here at home. And secondly, when Osama bin Laden was killed in 2011, that was for most Americans the impetus for this war. This war was about 9/11. It was about getting those who perpetrated 9/11. And so a decade ago, you saw public opinion polling really switch and be in favor of ending this war. And you began to see a growing number of Americans say the war itself was a mistake. Today, that number, as of the AP poll today, sits at 2/3 of Americans who view the war as a mistake in a whole, right? I think we're going to continue to see that lesson. One of the challenges is, and you alluded to the work we do at Win Without War, one of the challenges is just because the public believes something and gets there doesn't mean Washington listens, obviously. And again, the public got there a decade ago, but it's unfortunately taken us quite some time to get our elected officials to listen to the public. And I think that's one of the lessons we have to take away is how do we stop this system to continue where the public has withdrawn its support for U.S. military interventions, for U.S. military wars, but those wars persist. That's something we need to have a long conversation about. And we need to look frankly at the law and what needs changing to make sure we don't ever find ourselves in this situation again.
What are your thoughts? Maybe it's too early to ask you to say, but I'm curious in terms, for example, of the law. What do you see that might need changing? Is it executive authority? Is it something else? What were you thinking?
Yeah, it's a great question. Actually, just recently, a trio of senators, Senator Bernie Sanders, Senator Chris Murphy, and Senator Mike Lee, who've been very active on these issues, introduced legislation. We expect similar legislation to be introduced in the House in the near future that would actually get to reforming how some of these issues work in terms of Congress's war powers. Right now, unfortunately, the way the system is interpreted, there's debate, and I don't think this is necessarily how the law says it should work, but the way it's interpreted is that the president basically takes the country to war, and unless a supermajority of 2/3 of Congress are both able to pass a resolution making him stop and overcome his veto, it's not able to stop. We saw this during the last administration with Yemen. Bipartisan majorities in the House and the Senate voted to end all U.S. participation in the war in Yemen. President Trump vetoed that in order to protect his friends in Saudi Arabia and the UAE, but you couldn't muster 2/3 majority. That's not the way it's supposed to work. So what the legislation from these senators would do is flip that on its head and put it back to the way it's supposed to be, which is without an affirmative vote from Congress, that military mission would be immediately defunded. The president could ask Congress to give him that authority, but you would need a bipartisan majority to authorize it. You would no longer need this 2/3 supermajority. So we have to look at things like that create serious checks and balances. Look, the Constitution is very, very clear on this. Congress is the body that decides when and where we go to war. The president executes that policy as commander in chief, but Congress decides. And the reason the framers did that was because they wanted it to be hard to go to war. They lived in a time of kings and queens. They knew what it was like to go to war because of the whim of one individual, and they wanted no part of it. They wanted Congress, the body that would have to answer to voters. People would have to explain their votes for supports of these wars, to have to be the one that decided. They knew it would be hard. That was the point. The problem is we've gotten away from that. We've allowed Congress. Congress hasn't, we mentioned 10 years ago that public opinion turned against this. Congress hasn't voted on this since then because leaders in Congress didn't want them to vote. So they blocked mechanisms available to folks to vote on it. And we haven't had these votes in Congress. We can't allow that kind of dereliction of duty. We need to force members of Congress to vote on these. And look, if you as members of Congress can't bring yourselves to have the moral courage to vote for war, then you have no business sending America's sons and daughters off to fight and die in a war, and off to kill other people's sons and daughters, off to kill others in that war. We have to get back and fix this broken system. We need to really learn the lessons of the Afghan war and make sure we never repeat them again.
And I'm really glad you mentioned the Constitution, Stephen Miles, because I also think the founders, we know about their personal flaws and so on now, but I also think the founders felt very strongly and very negatively about the idea of a standing army. And if I recall correctly, and the idea that we have this massive military industrial complex that exists today, now may not be politically realistic to dismantle it overnight, but it seems to me that would have they would have seen that as going against their principles, their better principles as well. So, and yet we still seem to be, and I don't mean to be overly negative, so please don't get me wrong, but we still seem to have a political culture that has not caught up with public sentiment on this issue, that is afraid to criticize a war. Now, we've had some victories. Last time you and I talked, Senate resolution on Yemen, on our backing for Saudi Arabia's brutal attack on the people of Yemen, and our tactical support for that, that was a step forward. We've had steps forward, but I think by and large, there are two forces. I guess maybe I want your thoughts on this because this is your field of action. On the one hand, we have a bipartisan political culture that is very loath to challenge the sort of culture of war, machinery of war, however you want to put it, as evidenced by the fact that both in Republican and Democratic hands, nobody wanted to put this war to a vote, on the one hand. On the other hand, now increasingly we're seeing things like you mentioned a resolution or a bill jointly sponsored by Bernie Sanders, Chris Murphy, and Mike Lee, which pretty much represents the spectrum of political opinion from far right to what in Washington is seen as the far left and the middle, so somewhere in the middle. So we're also seeing increasingly, I think, conservatives as well as progressives, some of them saying enough is enough, is a distraction and immoral and takes away from the task of becoming the country we want to be. And I think, I don't know what you think. I mean, I know it's anathema to say this in some circles, but I think there's value in some alliances there. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, look, I think as you mentioned, we've seen politicians with deeply different views of the world come together to say we need to stop these wars and we need to change the process. And they recognize, frankly, that in those votes they won't always agree, and there may be differences, but there is a growing consensus amongst individuals. I mean, look no further than Afghanistan. Donald Trump and Joe Biden probably could not be too dissimilar politicians in many ways, but they both supported this. The reason they did is because the American people supported it. I don't think for a second Donald Trump had any thoughts about Afghanistan of his own, but he recognized that the American public was deeply opposed to continued U.S. intervention in the war, and that he would benefit politically from pulling us out. Joe Biden, similarly, I think, understands where public sentiment is on this. And that's a good thing for politicians to begin listening to the American public. I do think one thing we need to emphasize and we need to be clear about in our conversations here is we also need to make sure that those living on the receiving end of these policy decisions, those being impacted the most by them, they have their voices heard in this conversation. Look, we have heard a lot of commentary over the last couple of days from folks like General Petraeus and others. John Bolton has been all over TV. We have seen a lot of folks who were involved in the decision making about this war commenting. What we haven't heard a lot from is the voices of Afghans. We haven't heard a lot of the voices of folks who know what it's like to be on the receiving end of U.S. foreign policy. That too is beginning to change. Congresswoman Ilhan Omar is herself a refugee from a place that the U.S. has been militarily involved in, Somalia. She has been very outspoken, knowing what it's like to be in these situations. Her voice has been very important in these moments. We need more voices like that, both in Congress, but we need those in Congress to listen to voices like that. There are amazing groups out there, like Afghans for a Better Tomorrow, who are doing important work right now to say this is what you can do to actually help and aid Afghans, particularly women and children. There are amazing feminist peace builders who are working on this right now with folks on the ground in Afghanistan. And we need to start listening to their voices a lot more, because very, very few of them have said what they wanted was a U.S. military occupation and years of war, right? Their voices need to be heard in these conversations, and that is part of it. And it goes far beyond Afghanistan. We take very little consideration for those on the receiving end of U.S. foreign policy when we have these conversations. That includes also the men and women in the U.S. military who we send to fight in these wars. Their voices obviously are beginning to be heard more often as well, but are an important part of this conversation. So we need our politicians to do a lot more listening in this, and I think we'll get to a lot better policy outcomes once they do.
Well, I think that's extremely well said, and I know you'll stay active on this issue, Stephen Miles, and I hope you'll keep us posted on this and on other related developments in our military and foreign policy. So Stephen Miles, Executive Director of Win Without War, that's winwithoutwar.org. Thanks so much for all your great work, and thanks for coming on the program.
Thanks for having me.
And we'll be right back after this. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is the Zero Hour.